The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending. We are ready to get started with today's webinar titled, The Other Side of Cyber Risk, Missing Out. This webinar will last 30 minutes and will include time for questions and answers. We encourage you to send your questions into the Q&A box, and we will address those during the webinar. This session will be recorded, and a link to the recording along with the slides will be emailed after the webinar. We ask that you mute your lines to minimize the noise. Today, we're delighted to have Anne Flynn, Program Director of Education Innovation at NSBA, and Dottie Schindlinger, VP and Governance Technology Evangelist at Board Docs with us to lead today's webinar. Welcome, and Anne, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you.
Thanks so much. We are so pleased to be doing today's session with Board Docs. They have been a terrific partner of ours, starting back with a survey that we did just over a year ago that pointed out the concerns and issues that school leaders face around issues of cybersecurity, which actually led NSBA to launch a cyber secure website to try to collect information to help school leaders navigate these new challenges. The website is broken into areas that deal with the Knowledge Center, tools, and career pathways. Each of those areas will provide useful resources, links to current examples where there have been challenges with cybersecurity, and help districts navigate the law and the practice that involve these new issues. And all of those resources can be found on our site at nsba.org/cyber. But this session today, I'm particularly pleased to be involved with because as we get more concerned about the cyber risk, at times that concern can lead us to miss opportunities or be so concerned with cyber that we might not take advantage of all of the amazing things that the technologies have enabled for us. And so I'm particularly pleased today to be looking at the other side of the cyber risk and missing out and what Dottie and her colleagues have discovered. So with that, I'll turn it back over and look forward to this conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Anne, and good afternoon, everybody. This is Dottie Schindlinger from Board Docs. So as Anne just alluded to, we did this work with NSBA last year to try to uncover what were some of the implications of cyber risk for school board leaders. And that report very much focused on what I would kind of consider the hairy, scary, negative side of cyber, really looking at things like cyber attack and potential data breach and the way that school boards either are or are not prepared to handle those kinds of issues in a thoughtful way. And so that report, I think, has been really helpful at allowing school boards to think about those issues a bit more, begin to talk about some of those issues, and then the website and other resources that NSBA have put together on the Cyber Secure website have been just tremendous. And so hopefully many of you have started to use those resources and begin to have those important conversations in your boardrooms. But what we wanted to do today was kind of look at the other side of cyber risk, right? Cyber risk can be about how do we avoid threats, how do we stop threats in their track, and when we do encounter an attack, how do we recover quickly from those kinds of incidents? But the other side of cyber is how do we also not miss out on the next greatest innovation that might have a dramatic impact on education or on things that our students need to know to be successful in the future. So what I wanted to do was share some insights from a book that we've just recently completed. This is now in the hands of Wiley, the publisher. They're in the process of going through all the final reviews and edits before this comes out in the spring of 2019. And the book is called Governance in the Digital Age. It was really focused actually on interviewing a number of board directors from around the globe on their thoughts and impressions and ways that they are responding to technological innovation and disruption. And while the book was really focused in the corporate space, we really saw a lot of the lessons to be learned from those interviews and from the conversations we had apply in every sector, not just in the corporate space, but absolutely in the K through 12 public education space. So we thought today, Anne and I would have a conversation with all of you about the flip side of cyber risk. What is cyber reward? What are the things that we might need to be thinking about from an innovation standpoint, from a strategy standpoint, particularly at the board level, what are some of the conversations that might need to be taking place around the board table to make sure that we're positioning our students and our school districts for the greatest possible success in the future? So the key question that we were trying to deal with in this book was really this one: what impact is technology having on board governance? And then sort of kind of a corollary question, because in our mind, it's always been sort of curious that technology and board governance seem like two separate topics rather than things that fit well together. And so for us, it was also the question of, and why hasn't this impact been faster, bigger, more obvious? Why aren't directors really being sought after if they have technology expertise? Why aren't there more technology committees being formed at the board level? Why isn't technology kind of the cornerstone of every strategic conversation that boards are having? Those are some of the things that were on our minds. We wanted to talk with directors about those issues, learn a bit about what they're thinking about those issues, how they're approaching those issues, and then most importantly, really trying to understand how boards can stay current. It's so hard. Technology changes every 3.5 seconds. And if you think about some of the big disruptors out there, things like artificial intelligence, virtual reality, blockchain, augmented reality, there are lots of things happening now that can have major implications on the way that we do everything, and actually have had major impact on the way we do many things so far. So we really wanted to understand how are boards dealing with all this stuff. So that's just a little bit of a backdrop to what Ann and I wanted to discuss today. And so Ann, I know you had a number of questions that you wanted to kind of dive into. I think you certainly have a lot to say on these issues as well. I know in our prep calls and our prep conversations, these are things about which you're pretty passionate too. So I'm eager to just talk with you and find out, kind of what's on your mind, and maybe we can also start to take some questions in from our attendees as well.
Well, Dottie, one of the first ones in the work that you've been doing that goes beyond just the education sector is how would you actually go about defining innovation? Sometimes people just say the next new thing, but is there a more complicated or more complex definition that you use to define innovation?
Absolutely, yeah. And I will say, first of all, just as you pointed out, there's many different ways to think about innovation and to define it. What we heard time and again in the interviews that we conducted with directors is the way that they are thinking about innovation is what are the technologies or the trends in the market or the ways that the economy is moving that could have a substantial impact on their ability to be a sustainable and successful enterprise. So I want to think about innovation in that way, in the way of, if we kind of extrapolate that to K-12 public education, what are the things that are happening right now or will be happening in the near future that could have a dramatic impact on the way we think about education or on the way we think about successful outcomes for students? And if you think about it, there's a lot of different ways that that could play out. There's a kind of a new macro trend that will be, I think, really rearing its head in the next 5 to 10 years of quantum computing, which has the potential to completely upend how we think about computing. And if you think about just, as I just say that out loud, that probably feels so big and so hard to wrap your arms around. And that's exactly what I think we can expect. There's going to be these big seismic movements out there in technology and in the way that we conduct business, research information, think about things, talk to one another, learn, that could have a huge impact on how people proceed and on what success will really mean in the future. So when we think about innovation, I like to think about it in that kind of pragmatic way, not sort of in a futuristic way of will we have flying cars? not really in that way, but more thinking about it as what are the things that are just about to come on the forefront that we need to know about now, because they're likely to have such seismic repercussions that if we don't start thinking about it now and preparing now, we could be caught completely flat-footed. So I like to sort of think of innovation in that kind of pragmatic, strategic way.
So Dottie, that's a great example to tie back specifically to the other side of cyber risk, because several of the things that you alluded to rely on things like big data. Rely on having information, watching people's trends, becoming smarter as, for instance, in software, a student uses something, it begins to learn you and contributes your knowledge base into a bigger database to help refine things. And so that fear of what you would miss out on in cyber, potentially tied to your definitions of innovation, are really, I think, something that lands at the board table. How much or how little about the protection of student data, disaggregating it, aggregating it, protecting it. Any thoughts on how districts can wrestle with those issues?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Anne, because, you know, that's one of the things we heard over and over again in our conversations with directors is that, you know, look, it's not that they don't understand that these are issues that they should be dealing with. I think what we heard time and again is that they're just not entirely sure how. They're not sure how to wrap their arms around it. There's so much. There are so many things that are new, and it feels like it moves so quickly. And let's face it, you know, the average age of board members, particularly in the corporate space, is about 62 years of age and getting older every year. It's not getting younger. And so these are individuals that didn't grow up with mobile phones in their hands, right? They come to this as a second language. They're not digital natives. And so they're just feeling a little bit at sea. They're not quite sure how to wrap their arms around it, how to stay current, but they know that it's a big deal. I mean, they really know this is a big concern. And so I think, you know, if we think about school districts, you know, the most important thing I think for the board to do is to recognize first and foremost that technology is not sort of this department issue, right? It's not something that's kind of over there and needs to be dealt with by an IT team, but that it really is at the core of everything we think about and understand as education and learning. And so if we sort of take that as the premise, and then we begin to think about innovation in that way and think, okay, if technology is at the core of how we think about education and learning, and innovation could change how education and learning take place, well, then maybe as a board, we need to try to challenge ourselves to understand what's coming and to maybe read some books by futurists, maybe have some guest speakers come in, maybe get out of the boardroom at some point and have an event somewhere at an R&D department for a local company in our local region. Try to understand what is happening out there that could have a big impact on how education needs to happen in the future. And just really be smarter about this. Be more open-minded. Be curious. You know, really just having that mentality of curiosity, of always challenging ourselves to learn more, to know more, to keep an open mind, to keep eyes and ears open. I think that's really the first step. And if we can really challenge ourselves to do that and not kind of continually think that technology is this side topic that some other group is going to handle, I think that positions us better to be able to handle things when they come up. You know, if you think about, for example, just to take a business example, right? Think, for example, of the company Netflix, which when it first came into being was a DVD mail delivery service, right? They were kind of based on the Blockbuster video model of video rentals by DVD, and they would mail you a few DVDs and you would mail them back. And in the span of 10 years, their business model has gone from being a DVD delivery service to basically being a content production company. And the reason that was able to happen was they were able to watch what was happening in the market and see that things like streaming and being able to download video on demand and content on demand was going to be the way of the future. And so they completely shifted their business model to be less about delivering other people's content and more about developing the content that they could then deliver through their streaming service. And that has served them very, very well. They would not have been able to make any of those pivots if the board and the top leadership of that company hadn't been keeping an eye on those kind of macro trends and understanding how that might apply back to them. So I think it's that kind of creativity. I think it's that kind of nimbleness that school boards really should start to try to adopt in their thinking about cyber, not just the how do we keep the baddies out of our data, but how do we think about positioning our districts for the future in a way that is going to be material and meaningful to our students and our population.
Well, Dottie, you know, NSBA back in the late 1980s started talking about technology and innovation to help leadership teams grasp what technology could bring to the K-12 space. And initially, most of those conversations really focused on changing teaching and learning. But consistently over the last 20 years plus that I've been working in this space, we've seen the technology impacts not only touch teaching and learning in the classrooms and outside the classroom, but also to transform how districts are doing their operations, their administrative tasks, their everything from inventory to food service to bus transportation with GIS and all sorts of tools to streamline those areas, plus as a communication tools with the advent of social media, with districts being able to notify parents in cases of emergency, help them keep up with their child's homework, to actually just keep them well informed, whether that's through Facebook or Twitter, through social media. So we've seen a lot of innovations across the education community, but the disruptive industries you're talking about, like Netflix and like Uber, disrupted the transportation industry. I'm not sure a lot of educators and school leaders have really thought about the K-12 system being disrupted in the same kind of way that these other disruptive things have taken off in other industries. The one that comes to mind certainly is the conversations around blended learning and online learning in virtual schools, the student being the center of learning with resources from museums and creating portfolios in the future. But that whole disruptive nature for education is an important one that I think our school leaders have to try to think about in a different way. We've certainly seen districts go up and meet with FedEx, for instance, in Memphis to understand how their operations work, or look at the leadership codes of the Ritz-Carlton in developing customer service attitude. So we know that districts sometimes look outside of their own industry to look at innovation, but do you have suggestions on some of the other industries that our board members and school leaders might consider looking at?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. First of all, I just want to go back and say, through your comments, I'm over here nodding my head and saying every time you're speaking, because I think that's exactly it. You know, so a couple of things come to mind. I think probably the big one right now today that if school boards are not talking about, they really should add to the agenda is artificial intelligence. Look, artificial intelligence powers a lot of our world now. If anybody has Alexa in their homes, or, ever picks up their phone and asks Siri a question or says, "Hey, Google," they're already using artificial intelligence on kind of a daily basis. And I think the reason that artificial intelligence is a good example of the kind of thing that could be very disruptive in the education community is, artificial intelligence could change what does it mean to learn something, right? If you think about it, if you can just talk to a machine and a machine can answer any question for you, is there still the same kind of value that we should be placing on having students memorize things, for example? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm certainly not an educator, and I don't want to, get into that debate. What I'm saying is those are the kinds of things that boards should maybe be talking about and thinking about. What do we mean by education quality in a world where we can ask our phone any question and have an answer in far less time than it would probably take our human brains to recall that information? So I think we're coming up into a different place where we need to have a different approach to thinking about the strategy and thinking about how we interact with that environment to create new and meaningful things, right? So learning and education, maybe it becomes less about memorization and more about good critical thinking skills. Maybe it becomes less about how much information can you recall at a moment's notice, and more about, can you have insightful questions that you can put into the machine that then lead us to new insights? Again, I'm not the right person to answer those questions. What I'm suggesting, though, is that boards should start asking. Boards should really start thinking in this way and just start having these kinds of conversations around the table about, what are the disruptors? Let's just take, for example, you mentioned Uber. Here's a good example of how that very same disruptive technology is having an impact on schools. There's now a number of students that get to school using services like Uber. Uber, in fact, is really investing heavily in autonomous vehicles, and that's going to have a major implication for things like busing. If you start to think about autonomous busing, which is, I think, going to be one of the places where we might invest most heavily in autonomous vehicles at the outset, is having autonomous busing. And so there are lots of things that could be coming down the pike that are maybe rearing their heads in the corporate space first, that we shouldn't ignore. We shouldn't pretend that those are not going to have an impact on how our schools operate, right? So we have to start to kind of think in that way. What are the things out there in the world that we might need to think about? And if I could just put in one suggestion, I'm pretty unapologetically evangelical about this issue. And of course, I'm the governance technology evangelist for Board Docs, and so it's probably not going to surprise you that I say this, but to me, it just seems like it is kind of impossible for a board to ask these questions well and to do a thoughtful and good job thinking about technology, innovation, and disruption if as a board they are stuck in the Middle Ages, if they are still getting all their materials on paper, if they are still only communicating with each other, in very traditional fashion, they're going to find themselves left behind really fast. You need to be able to get at a moment's notice a history of how you have dealt with certain issues, what policies you have on issues, how you've discussed things, approached things, handled things, and you need to be able to use that to arrive at better questions and better insights for your next upcoming board meeting. And I'm sorry, you cannot do that if everything you have is on paper. It's just not possible. And it's just silly now. We're in an age when there are so many tools available to schools to be able to do this well. So if your district is still handling all your board meeting processes on paper, that would be the first hard question to discuss at the board table. Why is that the case? You are really positioning yourselves for the past. You are not positioning yourselves or your districts for the future. You're not doing anyone any favors. So I'll get off my soapbox, but that is something I'm pretty unapologetically passionate about. It just sees like it's time. It is time.
Dottie, I respect you being passionate about that, because clearly we've been advocating for boards and districts to take a look at doing e-agendas, e-policies, e-resources for, over 15 years actively. And there's other tools in other spaces that impact the board table as well. A startup company from a few years ago, Guide K-12, actually allowed border boundary discussions to take place real time with Google Maps and see the changes of student demographics if you move a district boundary 1 block or 3 blocks, or things that used to go back into statisticians to work on for a couple of weeks to bring out to another board meeting. And so it's amazing how the tools and technology are transforming and increasing transparency for boards to do their work. But on that question of innovation, so you're right, board members, not only in the corporate sector, but in the school boards, our study recently, I think, said average age was maybe 59, and again, serving longer. So is that spark of innovation in a district something that should be bubbling up from those board members, or should that be the superintendent's flag to wave, or should there be someone elsewhere in the district administration that sort of keeps the eye on innovation?
That's a really good question. In our conversations with directors, there definitely wasn't sort of a settled answer on that question. There were lots of approaches. I think the most important thing is to ask that question at your district, to really have that conversation about, can we appoint a group, a person, an entity to just think innovatively and to bring conversations around innovation to the board table. And regardless of sort of where it starts from, regardless of sort of who the initiating party is, it does need to be a full team sport across the board. So even if it's initiated by the superintendent, or if it's initiated at, let's say, the governance committee level for the board, or at the executive committee level for the board, or maybe the board chair, wherever it starts, it should then become a team sport across the entire board, meaning every board member should understand what's at stake in having conversations around technology, innovation, and disruption. And that we need to make sure that we are really thinking not about the immediate present only, but that we are also thinking about the future. And honestly, it's probably really impossible to prognosticate further than, let's say, 3 years at this point, because technology moves so quickly. We really can't, with any level of accuracy, predict what it's going to look like 5 years from now. I mean, that's just the truth. But what we can say is that within the next 3 years, we can probably have a pretty clear picture of some of the major movers that are going to make waves for us. Now, we might not get it all right, and that's okay, as long as we are kind of keeping an eye out there and an ear out there, and we're being creative. I think you mentioned, having conversations outside the district, like at FedEx and other places. Those are really positive steps. Go find people in the community that are doing innovative things and just learn from them. Or if you want, invite them to come in and present at a board meeting. Have them come in and talk to you about what's happening in your R&D department that our students might need to know, or that our district should know about. What are some of the innovative things that you're grappling with? What are some of the questions that your board is asking to help push the company forward? Now, obviously they're not going to necessarily be able to share everything with you. Some of that is going to be kind of kept under wraps until they're ready to tell the public, and that's okay. they can at least tell you some of the things that are on their minds. And that can be good food for rich conversation at the board table. And you know, there's lots of opportunity to bring people in and just kind of get those juices flowing. So I don't know that it's as important where it starts, as long as you've got someone that is just kind of thinking in this way that can raise bubble these issues back up to the board. So assign a party, assign a committee, assign a person to kind of be that champion of innovation, but make sure then that it's a team sport once that comes up to the board conversation.
Well, Dottie,
and actually, you know, sorry.
In terms of how districts, you know, can look at the disruption about how it changes their own work, but it also is important to look at it in the light of your career and technical programs. And we've seen a number of districts around the country start some really impressive cybersecurity programs, because we know that those are career pathways that for the foreseeable future, whether it's industry, military, across the board, that's an important career pathway. And I would urge districts that have not started to explore cyber career pathways to take a serious look at that. When you talk about that 3 to 5 years, for sure, I think our crystal ball is pretty set on that aspect.
I would agree. Yeah, and actually, I wanted to kind of maybe shift the topic of conversation a little bit too, Anne, because, you know, when we were preparing for this session, one of the things that you mentioned to me, and we just talked about it again briefly, is this issue of culture and sort of establishing a culture of creativity, of innovation, of curiosity. I just don't think we can overstate the importance of having a focus on developing that culture. And honestly, you know, I think you've said to me, and I would agree with you, that if there is not a culture that's embracing innovation, it's going to be very difficult for a district to be innovative. I think that's true. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, actually, about, you know, what are some of the things that can work for districts that are maybe struggling to create that culture of innovation and curiosity? What have been some things that you've seen work? Then I can share too some of the thoughts that the corporate directors gave to us.
Well, for one thing, you know, there's so many new ideas that float by, and it is important to use data and evaluate what you're doing, if it's working. So when an innovation is put into place, at the same time you're putting the innovation in place, identify the measures that you're going to use for success, for whatever that success that you predefine might be, and to get a culture where the use of data and looking at the success of something is seen in a positive light, not a gotcha game. Far too often we get caught up in a culture that's looking to play a blame game. And if you really want to support innovation, you don't want people to be reckless, certainly, and you want them to make good decisions, but you also have to create an understanding that some things will fail, and some of the greatest advances come from those failures. Now, I understand in the education community that it's also a challenge, because you're working with young children, with their life, their one chance to learn third grade math, so you want people to be very thoughtful and very careful, but you don't want that to impede the opportunity to look at new initiatives. So really creating that sense of failure can be good. And I know that's a really hard pill for a superintendent or a school board to explain to their local community and their electorate, but you have to create that safe space for everyone to thrive and get to the next level.
I think that's exactly right. And, you know, so maybe one suggestion to make, if those on the webinar have not heard of something referred to as the Agile methodology, that could be an interesting way to kind of help a board and help a district begin to move more towards an innovative mindset, right? So what Agile, and I'm going to do it very little justice here. There's a lot more to it than what I'm going to say, but at a very, very, very high level, the Agile methodology is really about kind of getting things out there quickly, and then having a mindset of we're going to release what we have, we're going to inspect it and adapt it as we go. And so it's basically a system that is designed around the idea of nothing working perfectly the first time. And if you kind of have that as your approach and that as your mentality, well, then really it's not so much failure as it is constant testing and refinement. And so having kind of an attitude of, you know, it's okay for us to experiment. It's okay for us to constantly test and refine, inspect and adapt. That makes things feel a bit safer, and it definitely allows you to be more nimble and allows you to be more responsive to things that might be changing out in the world, particularly from an innovation standpoint. As new technology comes up, maybe you're not prepared tomorrow to, start using a particular kind of technology, or you're not even sure what its implications are going to be for your district. But if you're kind of always tweaking things and you're always sort of inspecting and adapting, continuously kind of improving and pushing things forward, and having this mindset of nothing's ever going to be 100% perfect, then you can be a bit more responsive when something like that happens. It also then sort of forces everybody to keep learning. And I think we've both said this now a couple of times, that sort of lifelong learning and that ongoing attitude of curiosity is just so critical to this issue of not missing out on the cyber front. You really have to always be asking questions. You have to always be curious. You have to always kind of keep an open eye, open mind, open ears, and just keep moving forward.
And Dottie, so we don't want to miss out, I believe I was alerted that there's one question in the queue, and I know we're about at the end of our time.
Yeah, actually I did. I took a look at that question, and I think the question I can just really briefly summarize was, whether or not cyber risk has been kind of overblown. So there was sort of a question of, is the threat really as bad as people say it is? Isn't it really kind of overstated? Isn't it really kind of overblown? I would so love that to be true. Unfortunately, I'm going to disagree heartily. It's pretty bad. I think now they're saying that the average cost to recover from a single breach is up over $6 million per organization. Last year, there were over 200,000 incidents reported globally from organizations, and we know that that number was underreported by about half. We know that 1 out of every 131 emails is now malicious. We know that there are going to be more than $6 trillion being transferred through cybercrime by the end of 2020, I believe it is. It's really serious business. There's a lot of threat out there. Cyber risk is scary. There's a lot to it. I wish I could say it's not a big deal and you don't have to worry about it. I really can't say that to you. I would be lying to you. It's just not true. It's a big deal. But the flip side of cyber that we've been talking about today is just as big of a deal, that if you're not kind of keeping that attitude of innovation and how we can kind of continually look at new technologies and determine what they're going to mean for our districts, we're also really providing risk back to our district. So I wish I could say that you're right. I just don't agree, unfortunately.
Well, if you look at the headlines from this weekend, I believe it's the Marriott Starwood that may be the largest cyber threat that we've ever seen.
Right. Yeah, 500 million records were breached. I mean, and that includes credit card data, that includes birthday information, that includes, passport numbers. It includes records of where you've stayed and when. I mean, that's a lot of information that bad actors can use to do bad things to you. And so, it's serious business. We have to take it seriously. We have to treat it as a very credible and serious threat kind of all the time. But I also think that shouldn't make us bury our heads in the sand and say, well, technology is not for us. That's like saying air is not for us. I mean, unfortunately, we live in the world we live in. The world we live in is run and powered by data. It's run and powered by the internet and by technology. And so we can't pretend it's not something that we need to take seriously and deal with. But I just also think we shouldn't always look at it as such a draconian, horrible thing. We should recognize that there's great opportunity for our schools as well. And so we should really kind of approach it with that mindset.
Well, they say information is power, and I think the more knowledgeable our boards are and our staff in our districts, they can make the critical decisions about when to move forward and how to do it thoughtfully and carefully so that it's a win for the district.
I totally agree. Well, Anne, I think we might be at our time, but this has been such good fun. I hope that if people have other questions, they'll reach out to us. This is our contact information here on the screen. You can reach Anne and myself. I think we'd be delighted to hear from you and speak with you. And as Amanda mentioned at the beginning of this session, we will be sending out the link to the recording of today's webinar along with the slides and some additional information. And I want to put in a plug just really briefly for the NSBA Cybersecure website. It is such a tremendous resource. NSBA has done just a phenomenal job of putting together resources that are helpful for schools, really tailored to the needs of school districts. So by all means, please take some time and check out that great resource and get to know, all the things that NSBA can offer to you in this area. I think NSBA is doing some really innovative work, and so use them as your partner. They're amazing to work with.
Thanks so much, Dottie.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks everybody for attending. We hope this was a good session for you, and have a really good day.